Good afternoon, everyone.
My name is Artie Kia. Uh, I've been teaching here for the last 25 years. I remember that first we started a course on Central Southwest Asia. Primarily, it was a team taught course. There were three of us, and the only time that we could compromise was a Wednesday late afternoon, evening. We were on the third floor of Social Science Building, that is 344, Social Science 344. And we thought, well, if maybe 20 people show up, that will be a great deal. And then after a few minutes, actually, class, it says 65, the capacity, the number that the class could hold, and then a few people were bringing extra chairs, 67, 68 people. We started that very one course that eventually it turned to an option, a minor, a major, and we are very thankful you are here. And I'd like to thank you all, and then I would like also, before we start, to thank our sponsors, Central Southwest Asian Studies Center, Shanghai International Studies, CSU University, Montana World Affairs Council, Office of Provost and Vice President for Academic Affairs, Department of History, Defense Critical Languages and Culture Program, Maureen and Mike Mansfield Center. What we are doing this afternoon is that primarily we're going to start with 20 minutes presentation by six wonderful people within the department. We have excellent students within our department, and you will see that. You're going to be impressed by six wonderful presentations. One after the other. Ashley is going to go first, then Kurt, then Jared, then Curtis, then Carson, and then Chris. And I would like them, each person that comes up, talk a little bit about himself or herself, and then after presentation, each presentation, 20 minutes, we're going to open to question and answer, so you can jot down your questions, whether it's macro general question or micro specific question from someone within the panel. And then we take it from there. So it's going to be back-to-back presentations. And I would like to ask you to join me to welcome Ashley Jensen.
Hi, everybody. Is this working? Okay. My name's Ashley Jensen. I'm a student here at the University of Montana. I have my undergraduate degree in anthropology, archaeology, and my minor in Central Asian Studies. I'm getting started here with my presentation. The early interconnectivities of Central Asia. So it starts out, autonomically modern humans are leaving Africa around 90 to 30,000 years ago. This area, they're first going into Israel, up into Europe, the far north up here, and spreading across. But these aren't virgin lands that they're going into. There's already other species there. They're coexisting with Neanderthals, and they're also running into the Homo sapien denisova around 41,000 years ago. This is just a timeline showing how late humans are, like, really in there. Homo sapiens at the end, and there's a whole timeline of other things. The key to preservation is going to be through heat, salt, cold, and caves. And to get organic preservation, you're going to be able to do a lot of other things with that. You're going to be able to date it, tell different DNA types, and it can tell you a lot of different things. One thing that you can do is a dental isotope analysis. Through this, you're going to be taking teeth, and you can find the strontium levels, and you can figure out where someone grew up, where they're from, compared to where they're buried. So that can tell you a lot of population movements. Many Stone Age sites are going to be really hard to date because you're not going to have the organic evidence that you need to be able to date that. In the Paleolithic, often assemblages of lithics are going to be used as time markers, so you can kind of indicate different cultures through the assemblages. Residue analysis can be done through the lithics if there's small cracks in ceramics and lithics. Often you can get enough residue to be able to tell the DNA or what's going on in there, so what kind of animals they would be killing, what they're using, and those sorts of things. The Gravettian expansion is a split of the Aurignacian toolset. So people in Europe, around Central Europe, Czech Republic area, have a certain toolset that's blades with microchips in the edges, Venus figurines, and it's almost identical to a site in Asia, around Lake Baikal, that has the same assemblages. So that's an indication that the same groups or same ideas are kind of moving. There is also DNA link, so it is proven that this is a migration instead of transmission of ideas. Also, in South Asia, there's another lithic assemblage that is very, very similar to the assemblages found in Malta. You have the microblade cores that are cylindrical and different chipped edges that are just very similar. The Yamuna migration and Kuragan hypothesis is going to be people moving rapidly into areas of Central Europe from the area of Lake Baikal in Central Asia. This is a rapid movement, so people are escaping something, most likely a plague. It's mostly young men coming in and marrying into populations in Europe. So this is kind of saying that something is going on in this area where people are just moving very rapidly. 12 to 14,000 years ago, there is two sites that are around the same time that have identical assemblages pretty much. They have the same blades with chipped edges, microblade cores, and one of them is in Dry Creek, Alaska, and the other one is Duktai Cave, Siberia. And that's kind of showing a link between transmission of ideas throughout the Arctic. And why are people migrating? Often they're looking for new resources to utilize different territories and resources. But also they could be escaping hardships. There could be war, plague, climate change. Something is just going on where they need to leave. It also could just be a transmission of ideas and styles due to trade. So it could be people aren't moving, it's just their ideas. Here we have a graph that's just kind of explaining the climate change that's happening between the Pleistocene-Eocene shift. Everything's changing, so you could have somewhere that has temperate forest that is suddenly tundra, so people and animals are moving. And this is the Bering Strait region. Right in here, there's going to be different groups that are all on both sides of the peninsula around 2,000 years ago. These groups are similar but different, and they're all Yupik-speaking tribes. This is a map to kind of get your bearings. Way up here is the Bering Strait region in Russia, and all the way down here is Central Asia. The people in the Arctic have a heavy reliance on sea ice. Sea ice was very important to them because they got their living off of it. They often would use sea mammals for their meat, bones, everything. Right here is baleen. This comes from the whale's teeth. They also, in a place that you don't have trees, you got to keep warm because it's very, very cold. They're using the oil for lamps to keep warm and have light. Also, because half of the year is going to be dark all the time in the Arctic, it's going to be very cold. Right here, there is a connection between the Liangzhu culture of the lower Yangtze River Valley in China and the Akvik culture of the Arctic. The Liangzhu is around 2,000, 3,000, right in here. And up here, it's a connection that we'll see here. The artistic styles are very, very similar. You're going to have the repeating geometric shapes. Right here, this is a pottery paddle that they're going to be potting the pottery to get the designs. Also, really anthropomorphic figures on both sides. Over here is the Yupik artifacts, and over here is the Liangzhu. One difference is the materials they're using. Over here in China, they're going to have jade and things like that, and over here, they're going to have ivory and other materials. They're also very similar because they have the animal figures right in here. This is a trident figure. And it's going to be like a weight for a boat or bows and things like that. And they're going to have the same thing in the Arctic, just a little bit different styles. The Scythian art is very similar to the Yupik too. These people are going to be having more gold and things like that as compared to the ivory again, but still the similar repeating patterns, as you can see right in there. Also, pointing out the Scythian pin right here, it has the curled horns, so it's been theorized that this is a reindeer, which is interesting because there aren't any reindeer now in Central Asia. Cape Espenberg is a site in Alaska that has some really interesting connections to Asia. It has a piece of bronze that dates back 1,000 years that has been sourced and been manufactured in China or Korea. This is also interesting because the Bronze Age in Asia happened much, much earlier than 1,000 years ago. Just a side note on here, this is the same time that the Tula expansion is happening, where the Tula are going to be moving from the Western Arctic to the Eastern Arctic very quickly. And the Eastern Arctic is also a source of iron, which it's not proven, but it's just an interesting side note. This is the site that I worked at called Walakpa in northern Alaska. It is very far out there. It is 20 miles out of Utqiagvik, formerly Barrow. To get there, you're going to have to take a boat or a four-wheeler. It's just way up there at the top. It's a highly stratified site, so it's going to have lots of different occupations, starting earliest at Arctic small tool and ending with the Tula later on, about 300 years. It still has many modern uses. People still use this bay in this area. It is right in between the Arctic Ocean and a bay, so it's a very strategic point. This is the site we were working at. You can see the units here and the ice in the back. This is also in July. Working in the Arctic has a lot of different excavation styles because of the climate and everything. So you're going to have to work in July because that's the only time that anything is kind of thawed. It's always going to be daylight. The range in temperatures, it's going to get warm also, where you have different obstacles like bugs and things like that. And it's also going to be cold, so the climate can just, or the temperatures can just shift. The sea ice also has a very strong impact. When the sea ice comes in, you're going to have different obstacles to watch for, like polar bears and things like that. The melting permafrost is also a huge impact on sites like this because it's melting so rapidly that everything is just losing the preservation and it's just kind of disappearing into the ocean. It's also an area that's just very geologically shifting and everything's just kind of quickly disintegrating. That's why it's considered a salvage archaeology operation. We're just hurrying to try to get things dug out as quick as we can and get all the information that we can. And the discovery of human remains at this site was what really pushed people to excavate here. This is the slump. So this is the area that is falling off of the site into the ocean on the beach here. We're trying to get excavated all this and figure out the stratigraphy because it's all just so mushed up and it's very hard to tell. This is just from the top here. After you get all of the dirt and everything, you need to screen through it to look for the artifacts. We did a wet screening process because of the consistency of the dirt. We also did flotation to get all the organic substances out of the dirt. So we did a remote system because we were so far out there where we set it up to have a hand pump here to have the water kind of go through. The organic stuff is going to float and get stuck in the sift here, and all the dirt and other things are going to float to the bottom. And after we get all that, we have boxes and boxes of dirt to go through and lots of lab work. This is where we were staying on site, our tents down here. Right here is the bay, and it goes into the ocean over here. And also the wildlife. When the ice does come in, you need to watch for polar bears. So we had a polar bear guard at night where we would stay up and take shifts watching and making sure everything was safe. There were also walrus and whales and caribou. We also had a point where we had one of the people on our site that shot a caribou, and we ate him for dinner. We also had lots of artifacts that we have. This is an ivory harpoon head here with a side blade. And this fits into the harpoon sequence, so we can kind of get a date on it. This is a Bernark point. And this is a little fish or whale lithic that was found. There was also a little boat. So in the Arctic, you're going to have everything normal sized, but you're also going to have everything child sized. They were very doting on their children, and everything came in kid sizes. And the preservation is just amazing. This feather was just perfect out of there. This is baleen tying the sides here. Up here we have a seal, a mummified seal, that they did a bunch of research on, and I will get to that. Down here is a polar bear tooth, compared to a different type of tooth. There. These bones here were all out of one small unit. It was just very compact with bones. This is the research done on the seal. It turns out it wasn't as old as we thought it was, but it gave us a understanding of how natural mummification works. We got like all the stuff in here. And also, there was another kind of polar bear found there. This is a larger species of polar bear that is now extinct. It goes back to the Pleistocene age. This is also a reminder that during the times back then, there were other animals. It wasn't just the animals we have today. So there was a different kind of predators and different kinds of prey. Any questions? The end.
Thank you very much, Ashley. Please welcome Kurt. We're going to have question and answers at the end when all the presentations just are finished. Thanks.
So hi, my name is Kurt Seacrest. I'm a history major and anthropology minor here at the University of Montana. A year ago, I was living in Scotland, and that's actually where I came up with the idea to do this project. So as you guys know, the refugee crisis that has really become global news in the last 5 years is changing, but it has no foreseeable end. As of 2014, the total population in the world that was displaced would form the 13th largest nation by population with 96.6 million people. The UK only hosts 0.6% of all the world's refugees, while the developing world hosts 86%. So I'm going to talk about 3 different kinds of refugees that I identified in studying the refugee crisis over the last few years. There's majority identified refugees who are convinced that they have the same reasons for fleeing as the other population in their country. This occurs in places such as Syria and Afghanistan. There are also minority groups who are called event alienated refugees. They're fleeing because of past discriminations. The most famous examples of these are the Jews of Russia and Germany, as well as the Palestinians in Israel. The final group of refugees is much harder to define because they leave the country for moral reasons, such as disagreeing with the government, and they only leave in very small numbers. So there's not really cases of them as much as there's individuals. For my studies, I did past research on refugee crises in the UK itself. I'm using a couple of my contemporary examples, such as Asian refugees from Uganda. In 1973, President Idi Amin of Uganda expelled all non-citizen Asians from the country. There were 70,000 Asians who then fled to the UK because they were Indians who held British passports. They added an interesting mix of middle and professional class refugees into the UK. But because they were so different from most UK residents, British immigration policy actually changed from being a melting pot to being what they call a salad bowl. And the salad bowl is where instead of blending into the culture, each separate minority group has its own culture that mixes and defines that culture. Also talking about Kosovo refugees, this was the last major refugee crisis to hit the UK before the current one. The UK government gave millions of dollars in aid and was actually one of the top sponsors of refugees, but when it came to accepting them into the country, they only accepted a few thousand compared to many other countries in Europe which accepted hundreds of thousands. This can be taken as a sign of the neo-fascist groups that were growing in the UK, such as UKIP, and their desire to prevent refugees from settling in the UK. It also had to do with a rise in hate articles in British publications throughout the 1990s as refugees were entering the country. But now I'm going to talk about the current refugee crisis. This is Alan Kurdi. He really sparked the refugee crisis for me. This picture was taken in 2013, about 3 months before he fled Syria. The picture that sparked the refugee crisis in Europe was, well, that's weird. I have another picture, but I don't know where that picture is. But he drowned in 2013 with his parents while crossing the Mediterranean. His face became the front page of the refugee crisis across Europe. But also fleeing at this time, there are people from a number of countries. Syrian refugees are the largest group that we hear from because more of them have fled in about the last 5 years than any country right now. Other major countries that have refugees, though, are Afghanistan, Eritrea, and Somalia, because a refugee has to cross an international border. So most of the people who are actually in Syria who have fled are not considered refugees. They're considered internally displaced. And that forms, internally displaced people around the globe form 55.6 million people out of those 96. So they're a much larger group compared to refugees now. But these people, as they flee, they face a number of challenges. Most refugees flee a number of challenges, but these refugees flee more now because of the history of political violence that many people across the globe have of them. They're having trouble, even more trouble, getting into countries such as the UK and Germany, and including the US. But now I'm going to talk about the different four major political parties in the UK and their stance on refugees. So first we're going to talk about the Conservative government. The current Conservative government, under the leadership of Theresa May, who took over for David Cameron, follows a policy that Conservative governments have been following for years in the UK. Which is very anti-refugee, and it's not really surprising, as a poll in 2003 found 2 out of every 3 Conservative supporters considered refugees the main cause of public services being overburdened, such as hospitals and buses. The UNHCR, the United Nations High Commissioner of Refugees, even condemned members of the Conservative Party after they called refugees, quote, racketeers flooding their country with bogus asylum claims. The idea that refugees will burden the system has been around in conservative governments since Jews fleeing from Russia entered the UK back in the early 1900s. It actually caused a law to be enacted that prevented refugees from Eastern Europe actually entering the system. The next political party I'm going to talk about is the Labour Party. The Labour Party is very interesting in the UK. Being the other major British political party, they take more of the side of refugees, but really they use that as a club against the Conservatives. So whenever the Conservatives do something anti-refugee, they can really just hit them with it for seeming inhumane. In reality, Labour Party is also very anti-refugee and uses it as saying they're protecting the national culture. The major difference with this is old Labour and new Labour. Old Labour was before Tony Blair took over in 2001, and they recognized the rights of refugees and actually helped sponsor some refugee resettlement programs. New Labour immediately jumped into attacking refugees wherever they could, really. And in response, Old Labour was then accused of flooding the country with refugees. And that's why New Labour has become a major, not a major power in British politics, but has become a major change in British Labour politics. Now, this is the Scottish Nationalist Party, the SNP. They're the most pro-refugee party in the UK, probably because of their liberal stance. They're run by First Minister Nicola Sturgeon. The SNP has helped settle 4 out of every 10 refugees in the UK in Scotland. Glasgow is the largest city in the UK, hosting the largest number of refugees with 4 out of every 10 now, just in Glasgow. She's also ensured with the SNP that they provide more benefits to refugees compared to any other part of the country. And she's advocated multiple times for doing more for refugees, but the SNP forms a very small minority in the British parliamentary system, and they're shut down most of the times by Labour and Conservatives. The other famous party is UKIP. I talk about them not because they're a big party. Actually, they have no MPs right now in the British Parliament because their last one just switched to being an independent. This is their new leader, Paul Nuttall. He took over for David Farage after Brexit, and David Farage saying he had no more reason for being the leader of the party. They were founded with the idea of Britain for Britons, which meant getting out of the EU and preventing immigrants from settling in the country. They've been the most critical of refugees, with ideas such as only allowing Syrian Christians to settle in the country, as well as only allowing refugees who can show they positively benefit British society from settling. Yeah, that's most of what I got to say on them. Now I'm going to talk about some different aspects of refugee resettlement in the UK. So this chart, this shows Syrian refugees settling asylum in Europe. As you can see, more refugees have settled in Serbia, Germany, Hungary, Sweden, Austria, Netherlands, and then here's the UK. It's a very small number in comparison to the rest of these countries. It's probably got to do with the Schengen zone, in which when refugees enter Europe, they have to register as a refugee in the first country they touch down in. Most refugees don't manage to hop, skip, and a jump from Turkey to the UK without having to register, so most of them can be denied registration then in the UK. But I'm going to talk about the 4 different regions of the UK, being Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and England. Each in their own capacity, they've settled refugees, but their attitude towards them is a little different. Scotland's been the most accepting, as I said earlier, with refugees in Glasgow being the largest portion throughout the country. Wales is similar to Scotland in that they want to settle more refugees, but Wales forms a tiny portion of the UK compared to Scotland, and they've only settled about 1,000 refugees. The number on the bottom, this was an earlier number with comparing refugees to population, not overall, too. So, Wales has only settled about 1,000 refugees compared to about 5,000 in Scotland at the moment, and about another 5,000 in England. But they've actually even thought about having a refugee sanctuary in Wales in order to settle more refugees in the area. But now I'll switch to Northern Ireland. Has the smallest number of refugees. There's only about 50 right now in the area. But they've actually overflowed warehouses with donations that they shipped to the Jungle, which was a refugee camp in Calais, France. And then England is the major component of the UK. It's also the most anti-refugee. There have been, David Cameron, when he was Prime Minister, was called on multiple times to increase the number of refugees in the UK. But people in England don't really feel the same, with 2 out of every 5 people saying that they should stop taking refugees from Libya and Syria, while the Catholic Cardinal of England actually refuted David Cameron's proposal and called his long-term strategy of taking 20,000 refugees by 2020. So 3 years from now, they would take 20,000 compared to Germany's over 1 million right now. A long-term solution and being terrible instead of being a short-term solution. Now I'm going to talk about the application process. So the average stay in a refugee camp now around the world is 17 years. The average application process to get into the UK as a refugee takes 2 years. Now that depends a lot on if they're accepted or if they have to apply again and go through an appeals process. So every year, so refugees who are in this process have been analyzed multiple times on their mental health. According to the Warwick Edinburgh Scale of Mental Health, refugees in Scotland who are waiting to have their applications approved or denied actually have the lowest mental health category of any member of Scottish society, including refugees who have already been accepted, showing the massive burden that waiting to know if you're going to be able to stay in a country or not has on a toll. If they're rejected, they're also asked to leave, and if not, they are forcibly removed from the country. Now this is housing and employment. This is a picture of a refugee camp on the border of Syria and Jordan that houses roughly right now about 600,000 people. It's one of the largest refugee camps in the world, but you wanted to use this as a picture to show the difference in housing that many refugees have, because you can only get to UK now as a refugee if you settle in one of these camps for so many years, and then you're the 1% of refugees who are selected to be resettled in a third world country. Once refugees are accepted in the UK, they only have 28 days to actually find housing. Most of them end up unemployed then because they're trying to find a job at the same time. And to find a job near their house is very hard, is almost impossible for many of them. This also becomes a problem because if you're a doctor or an engineer from Syria or Afghanistan and you travel to the UK, your certification is not fit for their standards. So they make you do retraining. So at that time, you might not even be able to get a job with your degree. Now I'm talking about education. Education is a major part of resettling refugees in the UK, probably because many of the refugees come without any knowledge of English. They're allowed 6 months of free language training across the whole UK. And after that, in every portion except for Scotland, they have to pay then. Scotland is also the only place that provides them with free higher education, which in the long term, this allows the parents to get further education, to allow them to work. It can give their children an education then to get a job to help the economy in Great Britain and help them integrate into society. Yeah, this is my favorite portion. Cultural integration. Cultural integration. So the UK has tried a number of policies to integrate refugees and minority groups into the country. These have included wearing the wearing of turbans instead of helmets for Sikh motorcyclists, and the wearing of hijab for policewomen in London. A new campaign that just started recently is called Cup of Tea with a Refugee. It's a major thing in Glasgow, and it's where refugees and locals sit down and have a cup of tea together and show the similarities between their cultures instead of the differences. Another final program that has begun is with the SEPA, which is the Scottish Environmental Protection Agency, and it's where they take refugees into the Highlands to show them the natural part of Scotland. I'm a little biased towards Scotland, if you can't tell, so that's where I spent my 6 months. And then in conclusion, now with Brexit, the case of the UK really being a part of any refugee resettlement program with the EU is very bleak. But the problem with that is when the UK was part of the EU, they had their own border agents at the French border in Calais, preventing refugees from moving over. This is a picture of the jungle. This was the refugee camp just outside of Calais. And refugees would try to jump into trucks to take the Channel Tunnel over. With the UK leaving the EU, their border agents will have to move back into England. And the question will be whether French border agents then leave the tunnel open and let refugees more easily enter the UK, or if they try to shut it down. So really, the future of refugees, especially now that the UK is leaving the EU, is kind of clouded, and we'll see if the new government is more pro or more anti-refugee. In my mind, the next case will be that refugees will not be allowed to enter the UK. And that is all I have.
Thank you, Kurt. Welcome, Jared.
Hi, I'm Jared Miller. I'm a Central and Southwest Asian Studies major with a minor in Arabic here at the university. And I did a project on Afghanistan's failed entry into the modern day state system. Two things I want to say before I get started. I know some of you are students and you're going to be taking notes. I'm going to be talking very quickly, so we can have an email list. I can email you the PowerPoint so you will have the notes. Second thing, I will be showing a short video clip that has some coarse language written in the subtitles, but I think it's absolutely necessary to be shown, and it does provide a good example of the moral character of the people that we're leaving behind. So to start off, introduction, we're talking about 1857, and the Treaty of Paris is what established Afghanistan as a buffer state. And it was a buffer state between the empires of Russia and the British. And what happened then is, with mass amounts of foreign aid coming in from the British and the Russians as well, it developed into a rentier state. And a rentier state is basically one who acquires all, or at least a highly substantial portion of its national revenues from the exploitation or renting of indigenous resources to external sources, or just a little bit more simply, as in this case, direct foreign aid. And this guy, Abdul Rahman Khan, in 1881, he stuck around for 20 years, but he would use his coercive measures to establish a basic structure that would stay around for the state until the fall of communism in Najibullah in 1992. And what that was basically a Pashtun ruler ruling over a very heterogeneous society while simultaneously manipulating that society's segmentation and fragmentation to weaken its resistance. As noted before, massive amounts of foreign aid into Afghanistan from both Russia and the British allowed the various regimes to stay in power without any real cause to reform their administration or national services. So one thing is that Afghanistan, out of 652,000 square kilometers, 84% is covered by permanent pastures. But where that gets a little tricky is only 12% of the total surface of Afghanistan is arable. And of that 12%, only half is cultivated on any given year due to the scarcity of water. Water scarcity is a very big deal over there. Number two, throughout the history of Afghanistan, there's been a continuous lack of any sort of state-building effort, especially in the way that we would think, social services, administration, things like that. There have been shaky governments, but nothing that would really form a functioning, state. There have been arguments that, outside of Afghanistan's biggest economy, which is opium, there have been arguments that there was a regional war economy built up, but this is just a lie. This is wrong. There is no economy in Afghanistan outside of opiates, really, in my opinion. Third thing is taxes. So we have 85% of the population belonging to the peasantry, and 60% of production is agriculture. And so these numbers kind of come into play because they give you a sense of how much money is actually not being brought into the government. The peasantry is not taxed, and the agriculture hasn't been taxed until more recently, until the more recent time. And also another thing that this does is it doesn't provide a symbiotic relationship, scratch my back, I'll scratch yours, between the government and the people. The government is not getting, taxes from the people and not providing anything as well. We have to talk about Pakistan and the ISI, which is the Inter-Services Intelligence. This is the Pakistani CIA, basically. And these guys have their fingerprints all over the history of Afghanistan. And there's a lot of people that are involved with the ISI and between Pakistan, but two people in particular, Ashfaq Parvez Kayani. This guy was the chief of army staff from 2007 to 2013, and he was the previous directorate general of the ISI. Little thing about him, he was so popular, he's the first 4-star general to receive a term extension by a democratic government. He was listed as Forbes' 34th most powerful man in 2011 and 28th in 2012. He also served under Benazir Bhutto, who was the 12th and then 14th, if you want to count it like that, prime minister of Pakistan. She had 2 stints between 88 and 90 and 93 to 96. And one more thing is that one of her cabinet members actually referenced the Taliban using the term "our boys" after one of their initial victory at an arms depot in a place called Spin Baldak. In addition to the ISI, there's other Pakistan military officers throughout the 80s and the 90s affecting both the Mujahideen and the Taliban. Without ISI involvement, there probably wouldn't be a Taliban, or it would have never gotten to the point that it has now. And they show up in many ways with bribes, porous borders, intelligence and weapon sharing, etc. So we get to the 80s, and this is the time when the Soviets invade. Soviet invasion of Afghanistan was in 1979, and this is what sparked basically the initial jihad that we're talking about in this presentation. And it was a tribal or a local jihad because they had an external force invading their lands and coming and taking over and imposing their will. And this was also, in Afghanistan, they have something, it's called Pashtunwali. It's like a code of living or honor, and one of the parts of it is namus. And it consists of zan, zar, and zamin, and that means woman, gold, and land. So anytime those are threatened, usually you will have a council come together, or various tribes will come into a confederation, and there will be one guy leading them into battle or into any fight. At this time, we have the U.S. involvement. So U.S. covert aid actually began with the Carter administration sending communications equipment to the Mujahideen in 1979. We didn't go public with our backing until 1986 under the Reagan administration by sending Stinger missiles to help fight the Soviets. Another little thing here that is interesting to note is that U.S. kept up aid even after the Soviet withdrawal because we were that paranoid. Next step is to talk about the drug and transport mafia. And as much as the ISI has their fingerprints all over Afghanistan, this mafia has theirs over the Taliban. As soon as the Taliban came onto the scene in 1994, they immediately knew how to deal with them and how to placate them and everything. And in my mind, this is probably due in part to the ISI having dealt with them themselves for so long. They probably were giving them tips on how to do it, or the Taliban. And a couple things, with the drug and transport mafia, they immediately imposed a one-toll tax. They were able to open the roads. And there was a continued lack of infrastructural development, except for at a time when it aided the mafia. That was where a lot of infrastructural development during the Taliban times came. Breedis and Unocal were two oil companies that showed interest in Afghan investment and development. And this was the kind of glimmer of hope for state building. At this point, Breedis and Unocal both began to court the Taliban, and the Taliban were how do I say, courting them back, I guess, basically playing them off one another to expand their demands. But this was the only time that structural development was taken up by the Taliban that did not directly benefit the drug and transport mafia. Into this world, and I like this term, this nation of cemeteries, this is where we have the Taliban. And the most widely accepted origin story of the Taliban is that in 1994, Mullah Muhammad Omar was living in a place called Singazar, and he was the village mullah there supporting his mom and sister. His father had been long dead. One day, his neighbors come and tell him about this previous Mujahideen commander who has taken two girls, abducted them, shaved their head, took them to a military compound, and they had been repeatedly raped. And so Mullah Muhammad Omar got about 30 Talibs together, and they only had 16 rifles, and he went and stormed the base and freed the girls. And obviously this is a very good thing. People are going to be ecstatic, but also Mullah Muhammad Omar gained notoriety because he didn't want any credit. A few months after this incident, the same thing would happen, but this time it was two Mujahideen commanders fighting over a small boy who they both wanted to sodomize. And in the ensuing fight, civilians were killed. And Mullah Muhammad Omar again came out, and those two instances are the origin stories, the most commonly accepted ones. Taliban began originally, like I said, as an armed student movement, basically. They took the name Taliban, which means student in Arabic, to distance themselves not only from the Mujahideen, but also to try to project the fact that they were a student group not grabbing political power. Three main things for the Taliban paving the way for them. First, communist power was gone. With Najibullah and the PDPA, the Communist Party in Afghanistan, going out, communist power was all gone. Two, like I had just said in the origin story, that's a really good example of how the Mujahideen had done a fantastic job of discrediting themselves. And lastly, the ulema were basically not present or inefficient. A lot of times with these local and tribal jihads, they would be started by the local ulema or religious person, and then another local warlord or someone would come in and take over. So they had also lost legitimacy. Throughout this time, also through the 80s and 90s and even before, the government had pursued a fragmentation policy within Afghanistan. So the southern part of Afghanistan is very, very tribal, while the north is less tribal and it's more divided along ethno-linguistic lines. And just a little recap comparing. Tribal jihad of the Mujahideen basically had no ideology. It wasn't an ideological jihad. It was an outside force coming in. We got to protect our stuff. The jihad of the Taliban, there's three things that kind of set it apart. First off, the Taliban, most of them were born in Pakistani refugee camps. They were born outside of Afghanistan. Most of them had never seen their home. They were very different from the Mujahideen, who could tell you their clan history since time immemorial. Number two, a lot of them were also educated formally in Pakistani madrasas. This is something that the Mujahideen did not get. They did not get this highly Quranic, systematic teaching that the Taliban did. Third, the Taliban did have fighting skills that they had learned from the Mujahideen in Afghanistan and in the Pakistani refugee camps. However, they quickly became disillusioned and disdainful of the Mujahideen. Another difference between the 80s and the 90s is that, quote, for the first time in Afghanistan's history, the unifying factor of Islam had become a lethal weapon in the hands of extremists, a force for fragmentation, division, and bloodletting. So that just kind of points out to the differences between the Mujahideen and the Taliban in the 2 decades. Following the events of 9/11, obviously we remember the U.S. invaded Afghanistan, and this quick victory was kind of a lie, and it was mainly in a hurry to get to Iraq. We didn't have any true solution. We just propped up a shaky government, and we tried to basically do what was called dropping a government in a box. We tried to take our institutions, reduplicate them, and drop them on Afghanistan and make Afghanistan fit into what we thought it should be. Just catch up to us real quick. And the extent of our failure is best described as not what has not been done, but what has been done poorly. And this is best exemplified by a guy named John Sopko. His title is Seagar. He's the Special Inspector General for the Afghan Reconstruction. And in an interview, he was talking about electricity, because that's just as big a problem as water. So outside of Kabul, there's a $300 million project that it's an installation that was supposed to be the start of a national power grid. It doesn't run. The logistics are such that it runs off of diesel, and so for every kilowatt that it produces, the government or whoever is running that is losing 18 cents. So there's just really no effective or economic way to run it. Right now, it's actually acting as basically a conduit for energy coming from Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, 20% and 80% respectively. Now talking about the Afghan National Army, this is also tying back into the taxes, because the Army requires $4 billion minimum to operate successfully, and taxes are only generating $2 billion. So we're already behind $2 billion here. Over the years, of 47 pilots, 7, and this is again coming from Seagar John Sopko, 7 were counterterrorism certified, and most of that is because a lot of them are not night flight certified. They can't fly at night. In addition to this, the mechanic side of things, 70% of the work is done by U.S. contractors. So not only are they incapable of operating outdated Russian equipment, they're incapable of maintaining outdated Russian equipment. So it really is interesting to watch the Afghan National Army try to function in its best way. So reinsurgencies, main thing about the Taliban is in this quick victory and in that lie, we did not end the Taliban. We wounded them, basically. When we sent them across those porous borders that I had mentioned earlier in the tribal areas along the Pakistani and Afghanistan border. Travel between these two, Afghanistan and Pakistan, has been fairly unregulated for the majority. In the 80s, actually, or no, sorry, 90s, a guy named Sami ul Haq, he shut down his madrasa and sent 5,000 Talibs to join the Taliban. And I believe that was in 95 or 96. But he actually now holds a political office in Pakistan that is conveniently very closely tied to the Taliban. ISIS is also now making its presence known, mainly in eastern Afghanistan, which is interesting because they just jumped from Iraq, Syria. They have a presence in Iran, but not very heavily at all, or even in western Afghanistan, from what I can make out. Here we have a basically ethno-linguistic map of Afghanistan, and you can see that along the top up here, it's very, very much more diverse linguistically. However, down in the south is where, remember, it's really super tribal, and the government for a while, especially putting this on the south, had taken a policy of breaking up the larger tribal confederations that would come together, and they only recognize what is the village level KAWM, K-A-W-M. And so that whole southern area is super fragmented. And up here, we're talking about less division on an ethno-linguistic line. Like down here, if you could be a Pashtun, but you have to, normally when you introduce yourself or anything, you say where you're from, where, like, the valley that you're from. Where up here, if you're a Tajik, you're a Tajik. If you're an Uzbek, you're an Uzbek. It's a very different feel about the entire area. And in this, most of the Afghan wealth is in the north, 60% of the agricultural wealth and over 80% of the mineral gas wealth. So that is a lot of sharp division between the north and the south. Also, this leads it to be more modernized and more developed. Kabul has the biggest university, but the second biggest university is in northwest Afghanistan, and it's in Herat. So you also have, educationally, the north has an edge. South, like I said, more tribal, village level. KAWM is what was recognized by the government for a long time. This guy, Abdul Latif Pedram, he's an interesting character. He's an ethnocentric Tajik nationalist, and he supports secularism, federalism, and decentralization. And basically, he is one of 9 representatives for a party that's looking to establish what's called Greater Khorasan. And what that is it's a form of Persian nationalism, but he wants to take all of Tajikistan, Iran, and combine it with the northern part of Afghanistan, including Kabul, and call it Greater Khorasan, which would absolutely be devastating for the South. I mean, all the wealth is in the north, the education, everything. Right now, what we're leaving behind, I want to talk about the capability of these people. I've mentioned before, the Afghan National Army is basically a joke. It's severely undertrained and under-equipped. It has rampant drug abuse. The government is unable to meet the military and even the people's basic needs. There's constant raids on supplies and ammunition, gas, and everything. It's even led to gun markets, like local gun markets, having to sell jimmy-rigged, made in some chop shop guns to local militias. There's one militia, the leader is a 70-plus-year-old woman, and her 3 best fighters are her grandchildren, and the oldest one is 13. So, literacy, this isn't really something that we had an effect on. Like, this has been going on for longer than the U.S. has been involved, but it is still ridiculously low. A couple years ago, it was estimated to be lower than 20%, so we're talking about 17, 18 overall. And as I said, the government incapable of helping. At Kunduz, there was a group of soldiers that were surrounded for 17 days without any sort of aid or food or supplies or anything. And the only reason that the government even got involved was because the Taliban at that point, and this is a couple years ago, had retaken Kunduz Airport, which is a really, really important airport in the area because it allows you to get to the underbelly of Central Asia and to all those Central Asian markets and beyond. All right, so we're coming up to the video, but where the capability is lacking, the morality is basically non-existent. And this first quote, when Americans left, they left behind police, monsters, and pedophiles. This is from a Taliban commander, an interview, and he's talking with a Vice News correspondent. And so you kind of want to take it with a grain of salt, but when you have another commander that is quoted as supporting this statement, Major Struble, he says, "Over here we have a PB commander sexually molesting young boys, and there is nothing that we can really do about it." And so now I want to play a video for you, and I apologize in advance. The subtitles will have some coarse language in it, but I think it would be worse just to not show it at all. I think that would be a bad idea.
Yesterday, we had unfortunate news come in. A young boy, about 13, maybe 14 years of age, was shot. Now, there's a couple of things on there that you and I have talked about. We've had all the PB commanders in this very room about having young boys and civilians on PBs.
I have mentioned it more than 20 times.
I know. Why was there a boy on that PB? What did that commander say to you?
Alrighty, and is that all right, and so I thought that video, when I came across that, by the way, that is part of a full-length documentary called This Is What Winning Looks Like. It's about an hour and a half long. You can find it on YouTube, and I seriously suggest you watch it because it is eye-opening to say the least. And that's not the only instance of that coming up. That guy goes on to explain that no matter what he does, these boys will continue to come back because they want to. And it's just watching this guy believe his own lie is just incredible. But in addition to that, you have, like I said earlier, you have people high on opium. At one point when they were trying to build up defenses, the PB commander, a different one, pulled over a civilian car, asked the civilians, including children, inside to put sandbags on the outskirts of their structure to make it more durable and bullet resistant. And then he took off for 3 days high on opium because he found a bike. Like he didn't show back up to the place for another 3 days. And that guy that was just talking, that major, he picked out a group of about 20 to 25 people and sent them to, I believe, Lashkar for academy training. And over half of them were turned back the next day because they failed. They failed the drug test. So when you look at all of this, it is kind of interesting to see the parallel, remembering the Taliban origin story versus what is happening now. There do seem to be some similarities, some highly obvious and terrible similarities. Our typical response by the U.S. is our continued ignorance, and this isn't just by the U.S., this is anybody that has had interest in the area. Afghanistan, being a buffer state and a rentier state, has wish-washed and roller coastered through people's interest. Well, when it is of interest to people, they're there and doing what they can to protect their interests, and as soon as those are gone, they're gone as well. Also, this allowed our resting period for the Taliban, and so now there's actually a separate Taliban. It's called Tehrik-e-Taliban, and it is in Pakistan. And that's a little unsettling because they're starting to gain notoriety and power and everything, and they're getting several political seats. So now we're having a Taliban faction getting political seats, in a country with a government that has access to nuclear capabilities and nuclear weapons. So kind of alarming that we kind of just let it get to the state that it's at, but at least now we're taking another look. ISIS and the Taliban, this is interesting because there is going to be, not only will you have a civil war between the North and the South, but now you might have possible civil war between two extremist factions, which it seems like that could get pretty bloody pretty quick. And then recently in the news, we have Moab and Trump's involvement and taking a look back at Afghanistan and the Taliban and ISIS and everything in the area. Yeah, implications, nuclear capability in the hands of a Taliban faction. And what does this really say about our dedication to the area? We need to take another look at Afghanistan and understand that we can't treat it like other places. Everybody, the whole system is put in place as if, and I'm quoting Ben Anderson from Vice News, the whole system is put in place as if everybody wanted little girls to go to school, as if the Taliban were not an issue, and as if we're 30 years in the future. The best way to explain it is another quote by Major Stubel again. This is nation building on a psyche level. We have to start from the ground and treat Afghanistan individually. And that's my presentation.
Okay, thank you, Jared. Welcome, Curtis.
Hi, my name is Curtis Cheval. I am a student here at the University of Montana getting a history major, a global and linguistic studies major, and a minor in Southwest and Central Asia. I need to also tell you before my presentation begins that I do feature graphic images and violent images as well. So if anybody has any concerns about that, now is the time to leave. My project is based off of a research project I did with Professor Kia in a terrorism research seminar just last semester on Islam in the West, and this project, A Sociology of the War in the Media, is adapted from another presentation on a psycholinguistic and critical theory interpretation of war and terrorism. So I apologize if there seems to be any missing spaces in this presentation or if it seems clumped together. Without any further ado, I'll just begin. It is not radical to point out the hypocritical nature of U.S. foreign policy, nor is it radical to refer to the U.S. as an empire. Whether this is an empire by invitation, exploitation, or necessity does not matter. Rule over foreign peoples is an imperial project. This project of mine is an attempt to support the imperial hypothesis, an old idea with new evidence and an anti-narrative, more scientific methodology. This project rejects entirely traditional scholarship and instead opts to look to primary accounts and structural shifts for evidence to support the imperial hypothesis, crafting a historic argument rather than a historic narrative. The argument of this project, working from the fundamental assertion that we are indeed an empire, is that the propaganda system which sustains the imperial project works by manipulating context rather than directly manipulating content. And second, that asymmetric warfare is a consequence of asymmetric organization systems, in particular an asymmetric organization of political economies, geopolitically and globally. That while soldiers are not willing to die for oil and journalists often try to tell the truth, both are manipulated by the very structure of the imperial system. This is an examination of how the soldier and the journalist are manipulated by analyzing, in particular, military policy and structure, to point to the objective reality of the imperial project and try to find a direction to combat this and change the situation to actually hope to be able to bring peace to the Middle East. The first individual I interviewed for this project was a veteran who served both in Iraq and in Afghanistan, and he told me the first thing he told me was the story about well building and the clearing of a village in southern Afghanistan. He told me about a time he met with an imam in a small village who spoke perfect English and had a doctorate from a French university. He shared tea and laughter with the imam, and he was a captain in charge of his unit. The imam identified insurgents in the village, and following several successive arrests and house-clearing operations, the imam promptly asked him and his company to leave, although he offered to build a well for the village, a common project to try to win hearts and minds. Though sympathetic to the coalition forces and an international presence in his village to combat insurgent forces, the imam feared any actual evidence of cooperation with foreign forces, because building a well is not a way to win hearts and minds in war. Building a well is a way to mark a target in a village. Even despite good intentions on the part of the imam and a U.S. American captain, it is impossible to actually build legitimate cooperation when all cooperation makes an individual a target. Although the soldier, and not just this soldier, but soldiers in general, believe in freedom, equality, and the project of building Jeffersonian democracies in Iraq and Afghanistan, and although they believe they work for a moral good, evidenced by a quote by Elizabeth Palmer, a CBS journalist, saying that how surprised she was that these soldiers were essentially humane, with a very strong sense of right and wrong, and how ill-equipped they were to apply that to a situation like Iraq without enough historical, geographical, or cultural knowledge to actually have really understood where they are historically as well as culturally and physically. The Americans serving were cast into a difficult and almost impossible situation. The Western military tradition emphasizes that there is always a solution. However, as Patrick Graham, a freelance reporter working for The Guardian, said about Iraq in 2003, the country is going to hell. The Sufis and Salafis are getting together to fight the Americans, and you couldn't have found an editor in the States at that time who would have published a story about the relationship between Sufis and Salafis, but it was fundamental to Iraq. Why do people, I understand it's a very marine question, but why do people think there is a solution? There isn't, and that is precisely its tragedy. When withdrawal or troop reduction became a reality following 2007 after the failed attempt by George Bush's administration to send a troop surge to Afghanistan and Iraq in order to combat growing insurgent forces, and as soon as it became obvious that American withdrawal and troop reduction became a reality, all insurgent forces, be they Al-Qaeda, Taliban, Sufi or Sunni, whatever they were, had to simply wait out the American presence and not actually engage in direct warfare, which is what the military, being a conventional military structure, needs in order to actually dominate, in imperial terms, an area successfully and build a modern state, which was the idea in nation-building projects in Iraq and Afghanistan. This realization generated a phenomenon termed le cafard by the French, referring to the utter abject and depressive boredom of soldiers in the face of constant struggle, conflict, and vigilance. Heat, constant war, incessant sectarian violence, and a sense of futility ran rampant in the face of the scale of the violence. Senselessness was met with senselessness. U.S. General Bolger, in his book Why We Lost, wrote that as autumn became winter in 2011, and then as 2011 became 2012, le cafard crept through the back corners of Afghanistan, and to a greater extent, Iraq as well. Soldiers crawled into plastic porta-johns and blew out their brains, and Marines filmed themselves urinating on Taliban corpses and posted the videos on the internet. Denied the diversion of marijuana, hard drugs, liquor, and beer, rear echelon types experimented with painkillers. Sometimes alcohol was found, used, and abused. Young men huffed compressed air, a particularly risky high. The military chain of command dealt with all of this swiftly, often preemptively, yet it still happened a bit more with every passing month. The military is an organization that is by necessity near totalitarian in nature. By that I mean that the military desires total control over the lives of the men and women who serve in the military. This control is necessary to ensure the effectiveness of the fighting forces, but also to ensure that those who serve come home safely. The U.S. military, due to this necessarily high degree of control, both in practice and in theory, must also be a focus institution at all levels. Goals must be clear. President Obama in 2009, responding to George Bush's vague policy, said, "I want the American people to understand that we have a clear and focused goal, to disrupt, dismantle, and defeat al-Qaeda in Pakistan and Afghanistan, and to prevent the return to either country in the future. That's the goal that must be achieved. That is a cause that could not be more just. And to the terrorists who oppose us, my message is the same. We will defeat you." Although this was praised in the media, specifically the disrupt, dismantle, and defeat aspect, as a bold, new, clear, and concise strategy, clear and focused do not describe the actual implementation of disrupt, dismantle, and defeat. The U.S. could not take the action needed in Pakistan, as just discussed, and the U.S. military strategists could not realistically implement such a vague policy, and soldiers knew this because generals knew, which exacerbated the sense of le cafard and destroyed operational effectiveness of the U.S. military. Having the U.S. military, and particularly the Army's infantrymen, act as nation builders and trainers, occupiers and soldiers, while waging a counterinsurgency in hostile and unfamiliar territory, prevented the mission from ever being fulfilled. Attempts were made to rectify this in regards to deployment systems and military strategy, which will soon be discussed. But first, we have to discuss the American military tradition and the psychostrategic methods that it operates from fundamentally. The American military tradition is Prussian, Roman, and British in heritage. Strategically, on a grand level, in order to visualize conflict, the American military pulls from the Prussian theorist of war, Karl von Clausewitz, and two of his ideas are central to U.S. military policy and conventional army operations. The first idea is that you have to visualize war as a wrestling match between two forces, or two great men, as he describes them, which necessitates that the enemy is equal in form and similar in type. The second idea of his, friction, is the idea that in war unexpected phenomena happen due to the realities of mobilization, whether the limits and weaknesses of mechanical, industrial, and digital technology in the modern age, and the unexpected individual discrepancies of a soldier's behavior, etc. In Iraq and Afghanistan, the theoretical wrestler model did not hold due to the asymmetric nature of the war and the complementary enemy strategy. Instead of direct engagements, the philosophy of the Taliban and Iraqi and insurgents in general and guerrilla warfare as a whole was summed up by General Bolger as enemy advances, we retreat, enemy tires, we attack, enemy retreats, we pursue. This is actually originally crafted by Mao when the communists were waging a war for national liberation against Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist regime in China in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. Most guerrilla warfare strategy has been shared over the planet, whether it be far left radical groups or far right radical groups. And so they build off of each other and support each other because they're all fighting essentially the same type of conventional army supported by Western powers. However, in order to combat this shift in strategy to actually improve the operational effectiveness of the military, in 2007, as David Petraeus took over command of Afghanistan in particular, a new military manual was released, Field Manual 324 on counterinsurgency. Which generally focused on operations other than war, because in order to actually wage a counterinsurgency, you need to be able to maintain a healthy and stable occupation of the area. It features lines such as, sometimes the more you protect your force, the less secure you may be. Sometimes the more force you use, the less effective it is. The more successful the counterinsurgency, the less force can be used and the more risk must be accepted. And sometimes doing nothing is the best reaction. This could have come directly from Sun Tzu's Art of War due to the similar veiled and contradictory style, such as in warfare, engage directly but secure victory indirectly, and the skillful warrior stirs but is not stirred. This shift in strategy was actually successful for a short time, and the military situation in spring and early summer of 2007 began to improve in conjunction with Petraeus' artful manipulation of the media and the new tactics handed down to soldiers at all levels, whether they be 12-man teams of special operation forces or regular patrols. However, this shift could not alter the fundamental fact, and the core problem was not changed. Soldiers were still being asked to wage a counterinsurgency in wars they knew they could not win, in battles and trying to struggle to win a war they knew they could not maintain for a long period of time, accomplishing tasks and performing jobs that together could not hope to win the hearts and mind needed in order to actually build a new state either in Iraq or in Afghanistan. Domestically, hearts and minds were one, as the forms of mediation between the reality of the conflict and the culture are designed to sell a product, gain ratings, generate controversy, and support the war in general. In October of 2003, a good news and bad news debate developed. This debate was essentially between the press agencies, newspapers, and reporters on the ground in Iraq and Afghanistan, especially in Kabul and in Baghdad, in the green zones or the areas that were already secured by U.S. military and the presence of international coalitions. Reporters from the Christian Science Monitor, the Boston Globe, CNN, the Washington Post, Times, and many freelance writers and reporters all reported being pressured by agencies to deliver good news and ostensibly balanced reporting. The truth is that there is no such thing as good news or bad news, nor should there be. What was really being said when good news and balanced reporting was requested was, give us news that fits the narrative, because this news does not fit with the narrative, or give us good news, because if ratings are too negative, we will lose attention and viewership. In reality, when they say negative or bad news, they mean honest news. Their mere act of story selection and emphasis is an act of propaganda. As Gaith Abdul Al-Had, an Iraqi journalist reporting 2003 to 2010 in the Green Zone in Baghdad, working for The Guardian, said, "We are trying to cover the realities, and sometimes I strongly believe that because of the security situations in Iraq, because some of us are really jaded, we are actually not conveying how horrible terrible the situation is on the ground. I mean, I can agree with the debate that we are not getting the full picture because the full picture is so bad in Iraq. And still reading newspapers, you get A, B, and C is bad, and D and E is good. So this is kind of balanced reporting, but it doesn't reflect the actual picture. News is censored, not intentionally, not with direct manipulation of content, but through self-censorship with the obvious effect of manufacturing consent for the war. In this light, Dexter Filkins, a reporter from the New York Times, comment should be considered. I was with those guys, Marines assaulting Fallujah in November 2004. He means by guys for 8 days, and a quarter of the unit was killed or wounded. I mean, it was an absolute bloodbath. But I was there, and on 1 or 2 occasions, I was able to hook up my satellite phone, and I downloaded some stuff, hoping to get some stuff for my office in New York. I remember there were people sending emails to me in the United States telling me that I was out of my mind about what I was seeing and that I was wrong. Maybe I was wrong, but I mean, how would somebody in Minnesota who was sitting at their computer screen know? But anyway, that's the world we live in. Media mediates, and as the biases present match the biases of the viewer, politics is a product which is then consumed through media entertainment. The consistent misrepresentation and biased interpretation of data then does not appear as such, due to the normalization of the bias in the institution, the normalization of biased reporting in the reporters themselves, and after a period of time, this bias becomes an entrenched defining aspect of the media institution, which then becoming, rather than a reason to mistrust the organization, is in and of itself a reason to trust and choose the organization over others, because this process has happened to all mainstream reporting institutions. Once again, not intentionally to construct biases, but due to the necessities of competing in good news, bad news market economies for journalism and reporting in the U.S. Mediating institutions produce opinions, and once again, while there is hardly ever direct manipulation of the data, content is not manipulated, context constantly is. The limited representation of the data occurs without the destruction or the manipulation of content. So we must ask, how does this actually happen, and is there an example of this? Following the collapse of Saddam's regime in 2003, chaos reigned. The U.S. military was effective in waging war, incredibly so. However, there was no clear plan or real plan to institute an authority after the regime's collapse until the Coalition Provisional Authority was instituted later on that year. The U.S. military viewed Baghdad as an overwhelming success story and presented it as such. However, this is not so when compared to the reality. General Bolger, in his book Why We Lost, at one point writes that cheering Iraqi citizens and helpful Marine tankers took down Saddam's statue in Firdaus Square in East Baghdad. We see Saddam's statue just here and the ostensibly cheering Iraqi citizens. Anne Garrels, an NPR reporter, affirms that yes, there were people celebrating, but there were just as many people standing in shock. It was not just one big party as I think the cameras made it out to be. In fact, Morning Edition called me after the first feed and they were seeing the TV coverage and said, "Do you want to redo it for the next feed because it seems like in the pictures people are celebrating?" And I said, well, there are so few people celebrating, the Marines had to intervene, rightly or wrongly, with a crane to pull it down. Many people were just sort of standing, hoping for the best, but they weren't joyous. There was a very mixed feeling about seeing American soldiers in their midst. The propaganda system, and this is just an example of the jubilant crowd swarming U.S. troops as the 3-week war topples regime. Game is over, Iraqi diplomat says, and that's another consequence of this false and biased and destructive reporting, is that it makes individuals think that the conflict will be resolved when it is not going to be, because if it had been discussed that the U.S. military did not have a clear plan to actually institute a government after this was over, instead of just the reporters celebrating the destructive capacities of our army, we might have actually been able to draw focus to the fact that we need to build a government afterwards and after the regime is toppled. The propaganda system does not directly alter content, and if so, rarely. More advanced than this, the mediating institutions of the power structure alter the context of the information, its value, presentation, linguistic interpretation, narrative significance, and meaning. On a structural level, for the U.S. military, in 2003, the Army restructured the deployment system. They changed from 1-by-1 rotations to unit rotations, and the tour period moved from 6 months to 1 year. The reasoning was that this would allow the U.S. Army in particular to sustain a long war. Bolger, in his book Why We Lost, writes that the British gave the U.S. Army this advice, playing the role of the sage Greeks to the Imperial Romans. The British, who had relied on battalion swap-out for decades, and the Imperial and post-Imperial decades, swore by it. In the summer of 2003, facing a lengthy Iraq counterinsurgency, the U.S. Army bit the bullet, and one-year deployments by division became the rule. The reference to the British in the imperial days is telling. Whether or not the U.S. soldiers or even generals thought so, the U.S. military had structurally become an occupation force. U.S. soldiers occupying Berlin up until the 1980s had year-long rotations by division because they were occupiers, because it allows unit cohesion and effectiveness to be maintained. Historically, a significant dimension in this shift is that Vietnam veterans in the upper echelons of the U.S. military did not want a repeat of Vietnam, with single soldier replacements that degraded unit effectiveness over long periods of time and damaged operational cohesion. The social structure of the military reflects its purpose more accurately than generals, PR, and the media ever will. Furthermore, in Iraq and Afghanistan, even if the military does not see itself as an imperial force, pictures such as the following from Abu Ghraib prison, where insurgents were tortured and dehumanized, solidify resentment and destroy any capacity to maintain the moral high ground and combat the idea that the U.S. government or the CPA is different from Saddam's regime. General Shinseki, a U.S. Army chief, remarked in testimony to the Senate on February 25, 2003, that something on the order of several 100,000 soldiers were needed to control Iraq, a country the size of California with a population of 27 million. His comments were brushed off by Rumsfeld, who expected that they would be held as liberators, which we could have been given certain conditions and circumstances. But we entered and acted like occupiers. Even more damaging to the situation on the ground, the U.S. military did not actually attempt to control Iraq until the CPA, the Coalition Provisional Authority, stepped into place, and by then the situation had changed due to the insurgency in a way that required the U.S. military to become an institution of socio-political control. It is also interesting to note that the only building of the government that the U.S. military protected in the 2003 invasion of Baghdad was the Ministry of Oil, while most other buildings were ransacked, undefended, and the military documents necessary to maintain a modern state were abandoned. To the invading American coalition forces, de-Baathification was as much a necessity as successful engagements with the enemy were. Both were successful, but the former necessitated the destruction of the entire Iraqi structure and condemnation of any involved in the Ba'athist regime. This crippled the developing police state, as those bureaucrats, doctors, lawyers, and assorted experienced politicians who kept and understood all that was necessary for a modern state, such as records, tax data, legal codes, for example, were prevented from joining the state, and this hampered any attempt to rebuild a state in the society, because in a modern state, especially facing a counterinsurgency and terrorist operations, you need all the structures of police divisions and police states that we have here in the U.S. and in other more fully realized modern industrialized nations. Another individual I interviewed, Shaima Kanjami, told me that she would never forget the day the Northern Alliance, UN, and American forces entered Kabul, reflecting the authentic value that many saw in Iraq and Afghanistan of liberation from be it the Taliban or Saddam. She ran out into the streets without her veil on and told me she was so excited and so happy for all the possibilities. And Shaima later worked as the head secretary for the Minister of Women's Affairs in Afghanistan during the reconstruction. Something she commented on that I think is important to note structurally to analyze imperialism in this project is that Kabul became a relatively developed city. Shaima emphasized that a class divide developed as the nation was being built, as nation building, modern nation building at least, necessitates a politically enfranchised modern bourgeoisie, which meant the development of industry, government, business, and all the carry-on attached to Jeffersonian capitalist democracy. Kabul developed an economy. Afghanistan did not. Afghanistan is and was one of the poorest nations on earth, with a third of its population living on less than $1.50 a day, and the poor are almost entirely concentrated in rural areas. The high proportion of foreign aid workers, internationals, and the burgeoning political class located in Kabul alone, as it was a secured area, combined to create a modern capitalist economy just limited to Kabul. The fact of economic growth and prosperity was contained only to the city, and instead of being a sign of hope to the impoverished, affirmed Taliban propaganda, and the corruption within the government disenfranchised the rural population from state control. In every single imperial structure throughout history, originating with the British imperial state and its foreign colonies, there is a metropole and there is a hinterland. There is a center and there is a periphery. In the global geopolitical structure, the U.S. focused around Washington, New York, Wall Street, and Langley, and the Pentagon is the global metropole of U.S. foreign policy and U.S. hegemony around the planet. But the imperial structure constantly replaces and reproduces itself on a small scale in Iraq and in Afghanistan in subject territories of imperial structures. You always have a metropole and a hinterland, an exploiting area and an exploited area, which fuels insurgent and terrorist movements due to the economic deprivation and the focus and concentration of wealth in capital urbanized areas. Asymmetric warfare is a direct consequence of asymmetrical political economies, and the problem of terror will not be resolved without a fundamental reorganization of both economies, one an imperial state and one a subject territory, in the same system, in the same global reality. The imperial project justifies itself by the terror it creates, and the war machine is necessary to combat the violence, oppression, and subjugation encourage. Until this relationship is dismantled and the imperial project abandoned, terror will continue, regardless of the amount of force deployed, regardless if it's 59 missiles dropped in Syria, regardless if it's the mother of all bombs. Force cannot combat terror because terrorism is not a problem of the military, it is not a problem of the war, it is a problem of political economics, and it is a problem of exploitation by imperial forces or regular government areas. Thank you.
Thank you, Curtis. Please welcome Carson.
Let me just start my timer here, if I can figure that out. Yeah, my name is Carson Blake, and this is my presentation, Treaties, Lies, and Drawing Lines. I'm going to be going into World War I a bit and the aftermath of the Middle East. It's been the centennial the last few years of everything that's been happening in the war. One of my favorite quotes there is, after the war to end war, they seem to have been pretty successful in Paris to make peace to end peace. So a little bit of history pre-World War I of the Middle East under the Ottoman rule. The Ottoman Empire was about 600 years old at this time, very successful in the past. At this point, right before the war, they're being pushed back in by nationalism and European powers. But one thing that made the Ottoman Empire work so well for so many years is they had a millet system, a religious system where it was acceptance of Muslims, Jews, Christians, Armenians, and etc. The whole point of the system is they'd work together. If there's two arguments between two separate factions, example, Jews and Christians, a Muslim would predate over the problem and vice versa. But during the 19th century, and I'll just read here, the millet system worked wonders for most of the Ottoman Empire. With the rise of nationalism in the 19th century, it all started to change. Groups of people were identifying themselves by not by religion, but by nationality of cultural and social geographical aspects. And towards the end of the 19th century and turned to the 20th century, a group started in the Ottoman military called the Young Turks, known mainly as the Committee of Union and Progress, CUP, or Young Turks was at its beginning secret society in the Ottoman military that consisted of young officers and administrators with revolutionary and nationalistic ideals. The CUP would eventually gain enough power in 1908 to take over, where they pretty much installed a puppet sultan, and they were one of the biggest aspects that brought the Ottoman empires into the Axis powers of World War I, siding with Germany. And here's a map of pre-World War I, Middle East. At its time, where's the laser? At its time, the Ottoman Empire, at its prime, went through northern Africa, all there up into Southeast Europe. By the start of the First Great War, they were pushed back by things such as nationalism and European powers to Anatolia and the Arab Peninsula. The first big deal or lie we're going to go over is the Hussein-McMahon Correspondence. Negotiations between Hussein and the British would begin in the late 1914, early 1915, and would be a big dilemma of arguing what the Arabs wanted and what the British would give. Through much of the negotiations and backroom talks by late 1915, early 1916, the British finally gave in to Hussein's demands. The Hussein-McMahon Correspondence was written, giving Hussein and the Arabs supplies and payment to start a revolt, and also promised an independent national Arab state that was almost the whole of the Arabian Peninsula, besides some cities and ports. And if you notice on the map, this sort of gray area, and it's not gray down here, but this was one of the ports the British did not want to give up in what is Kuwait today. This is sort of what they negotiated to give, and during the beginning of their negotiations, Hussein was sort of, and even after the correspondence went through, he was unsure who to finally support in the end, Ottomans or the British. It was his son, Prince Faisal, who went to Damascus and Istanbul and was seeing the Young Turks round up Arab military officers and ousting them from power or even executing them, that he went to his father saying, we need to have something done, we need to revolt. So, June 5th, 1916, Hussein declared the Arabs an independent and declared the revolt. This is where the British brought in T.E. Lawrence to aid them with this. He was an advisor and friend of Prince Faisal. They worked together, leading much of the revolt and fighting much of the Ottoman Empire. But one thing to make the revolt work and to get the Arab supplies, there needed to be a landing point for British forces in Syria and Palestine. The problem is with how much they were putting into Gallipoli at the time, how much they were putting into Europe, the British themselves didn't have much of the supplies and sources they needed. The French sort of did, but the French were also too busy and controlled fighting the Germans in mainland Europe. So they started to reach out to the French, and this is what would lead to the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Mark Sykes left, Picot right. They came up with the agreement to, as you can see with the map, to separate the Middle East into mandates and protectorates for their people. Iraq and Kuwait would be under British control. Syria and southern Anatolia would be under French control. Palestine, being the whole holy city of Jerusalem, would be shared by French, England, and Russian Empire. And the Russians were also part of this agreement until the Bolshevik Revolution, which when the Bolsheviks took over, they actually released documents showing that this agreement was happening behind the backs of the Arabs and all that. It's argued a lot if Hussein truly knew that he was being stabbed in the back and lied to by the British. He probably had an inkling or an idea, but he never truly acted towards the end. But by the end of it, Armenia would never happen because the Bolsheviks changed that. The next deal we're going to go to is the Balfour Declaration. Was the promise the British gave to the Zionists for the national home for the Jewish people. More than Palestine was one of the choices for the Zionists, but they ended up choosing Palestine from just their cultural and ethnic and religious connections and it being their ancestral home. This is what would lead to, as we have been dealing with since the last 100 years, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. This is what brought the Jews and strong immigration into the Middle East. It wouldn't be truly become a true conflict how we know it today until post-World War II, but this is what would lead to that. The end of the war would come and the Paris Peace Conference would begin, Treaties of Versailles, which in truth, to me, in my opinion, was a complete failure. The Treaty of Versailles, how they punished the Germans and pushed them all into the ways they did economically and just all those aspects, it led and the late 1920s, this was what would lead to the Nazi Party gaining power with 40% underemployment. Many people backed Adolf Hitler, and to me, the Treaty of Versailles is what led to World War II. But with the Treaty of Versailles, there was some good points of it brought to like this was one good thing, even though it was a failure, came up by President Wilson, the King Crane Commission, after the war, wanted to put men on the ground to see what the actual Arab people of the Middle East and all the other ethnic groups wanted from the fall of the Ottoman Empire. The British did support the King Crane Commission, but the French were against it because originally the King Crane Commission was just supposed to be them looking in Syria and Palestine, talking to people. The French wanted them to go to Iraq, where there was also British military presence. The British said no. There became much arguing from this. France boycotted it. England backed out at the end, and only America was part of the King Crane Commission, which they got a lot of information, but still in the end was all ignored. And another thing Wilson's brought to the Treaty of Versailles was his 14 points, which to me were great. The only problem with his 14 points is, and him himself truly supporting the Treaty of Versailles, when he returned to America after everything was said and done in 1919, he eventually took ill and fell out of the political game. This American Senate turned away from the Treaty of Versailles and all his ideals with it, and we completely stepped out. Wilson himself actually had the idea of creating the League of Nations, but when he was gone, America wanted nothing to do with any such thing of that. Next treaty we come to is the Treaty of Sevres. Treaty of Sevres was taking the rest of the Ottoman Empire and separating it up between European powers, also giving the Armenians a chunk of land, possibly the Kurds a chunk of land, and then Italy and Greece. But this man stopped that. Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, he was a young Turk and a very successful Ottoman general. He had much experience through the war and pre- and post-war World War II, and eventually would start the Turkish War of Independence in 1920 to stop the Treaty of Sevres. He had much backing, much support from many Ottomans, and the start of the Turkish War of Independence, 1921, Ataturk began it by going all over Anatolia, finding support from old generals, old comrades, old friends, and eventually going to the city of Ankara, central Anatolia, and starting his war there. Every time, like for many months, European powers were trying to get him to step down and come to Istanbul and surrender. He refused. And even when Italian and Greece forces pushed into Anatolia to take their land that they wanted, he fought a ground war and fought back. Eventually, this would lead to the Treaty of Lausanne, 1923. The Conference of Lausanne began in November 1922 and led to the Treaty of Lausanne given by European powers to Ataturk to stop the Turkish War of Independence, and was a treaty that led to the creation of the Republic of Turkey. Fearing that he might be taken out or things that would change, Ataturk stayed away from the treaty himself, but sent one of his best friends and eventually would become his prime minister and would replace him as president when he passed in 1938, İsmet İnönü, and ordered İsmet İnönü to not take any concessions, nothing. The only thing he would take and the only way he would sign this treaty is if they would gain all of Anatolia as a whole and an independent Turkish state with no European influence. And eventually, on the 24th of July, 1923, that was given, it was signed, the European powers stepped down, and then on October 29th, the Republic of Turkey was formed. When all is said and done, we have these false mandates. After, with Britain and France, quote, mandates over the Middle East, saying they would be taught to govern themselves, but in truth be a bastardized form of colonial rule. The Allies only cared about control over the Middle East, and with colonialism coming to its end, they needed a new way to hold control over said part of the world, especially for the economic interests. One example of it is black gold, oil. Almost all the Middle East was under control of the so-called European mandates, excluding Turkey. You can see with this map, this is what eventually was given to the French, and the yellow is all under British mandate. And sort of go back to what happened to Hussein and the deal they made is the British had a shaved knuckle in the hole, and that was warlord Abdulaziz ibn Saud. The whole point of him is they were making these deals with Hussein, working with him. They're also paying this man off for the fact if Hussein tried to do anything after everything was said and done, Saud would rise up, take him out, and that's what just happened, and he was giving, as we know it today, the state of Saudi Arabia. And then with Hussein's son, Prince Faisal, Abdullah, originally Faisal and almost all their world recognizes him as king at the end of it to lead this national Arab independent state, and that was from Damascus. But because of the Sykes-Picot Agreement, where the French were promised Syria and Lebanon, the French ousted him from Damascus by force, and to calm him down, the British gave him Iraq. The problem with that is, like, people always wonder why, like, or question why they all hate each other in that part of the world is, so Iraq's a country of Kurds, Shia, and Sunni. None of them get along. So you take three people that hate each other, throw them in a room with a knife, what do you think's going to happen? Somebody's going to get cut. And that would eventually lead to all the quagmire we have that from today. And then the second son, Abdullah, would revolt against the French from what happened to his brother. But to stop this becoming anything worse, the British stepped forward, cut Palestine in half at the Jordan River, and gave him the east part of Jordan, which Jordan is one of the few stable and successful countries of the whole area today. Very good military. Still is, in truth, a monarchical society, but they have made it work for themselves so far. The aftermath and conclusion, quite simply, really, we all see it on the news today. 100 years later, when this all started and happened in the Middle East, we all still dealing with the after effects. Old empires who didn't want to give up their colonies just changed the name to mandates and still raped the lands and nationalities of the people of the Middle East. In hindsight, there was no good guy or bad guy to World War I. It was just a bunch of new and old empires fighting over the right to rule, govern, and decide what to do with the world. We are still dealing with all the lies and failures of the First Great War and the treaties and mandates that followed. And to me is my ending remarks on all of this is World War I was a very defining war for all of us today. We're still dealing with so many things from it. And if one way we can, it's hard to say how we can change it all with everything that's happened, but we need to start realizing, like, this has all happened because of old empires, old rules, powers that just want to govern and control, and us as Americans don't know better and messing with that part of the world. Yes, we might have not have been as big into it as England and France by the end of the First War, but by World War II and the end of that war, we dug our hands just as deep or even deeper than England and France. Thank you.
Thank you, Carson. Please welcome Chris.
All right, last presentation for you today, and I'm going to take you back in history a little bit. Not as far as Ashley, but a few hundred years back. My name is Chris Hansen. I'm a grad student with the Under and Central Southwest Asian Studies, or the umbrella of anthropology. My passion has been at the studies with the Crusades and the Mongol expansions. And while doing my studies, I ran across a lot of the games of the Eurasian continent. So I thought I'd talk about that, something that's a little bit different. So we're looking at about the mid-11th century to the 14th century, late 14th century, basically the collapse of most of the Ilkhan and Mongolian Khanates, as they would call them. And you can see here the area that I'm talking about, yeah, all the way from the Tibetan Plateau, Mongolia, all the way to Eurasia here and Europe. All right, some of the background. I enjoy the military history, and that's where I tend to focus on. I try to get into the archaeology of it so I can examine some of the armor and weapons and stuff that you see. But when you get into the areas of Central Asia, it's actually quite hard. They're not like Europe where they collected all this stuff and then put them in museums. I've been to some of the museums, such as in Cairo, And they're great when it comes to the pharaohs. They're great for the Greco-Roman period. But when it comes to the Islamic period, as they call it, it's actually quite disappointing and actually, in many cases, quite inaccurate. Nonetheless, some of the areas I'm looking at are the Turks and the Mongols. I chose those two groups of people because in the era of the Crusades, there's a lot of Arabic sources, Persian sources, as well as Latin and Chinese sources that have all been translated into English. I can read a little bit of Arabic, but I'm not that great at it. And especially if it comes to the early writings, I can't read it at all unless it's written out in a more modern Arabic standard way of writing. Anyways, what I was looking at is you hear about the Mongols and the Turks. They don't run as organized armies that you hear about when it comes to the Romans or the Persians, the Achaemenid Persians or the Sassanid Persians, or even the Han Chinese and the Tang Dynasty Chinese. The descriptions are always describing the Turks and the Mongols, and you can even go further back in time with the Sung people, the Sungnu, as well as the Huns who are invading Europe. And they describe them as just a mob of people. And I wanted to know, how is it that these people are able to work on the battlefield or even marching over great distances and still function as a military force and defeat all of these people from everywhere from China to Europe? And that's what I was looking at. And there is actually a fair amount of writing on there, such as Professor May. Timothy May has written on the art of war of the Mongols. So I had to step back and take a little bit different view and to what everyone else is writing. And my view, it comes with the horse and trying to understand how the Turks and the Mongols understood the horse. I don't know if any of you ever grew up on a ranch or worked on there. You'll learn a lot. I did, and you start learning the behavior of the animals, especially when it comes into mass. I did my undergrad studies here in both anthropology with the emphasis in archaeology, as well as Central and Southwest Asian studies. And watching some of the videos, you'll see them herding horses, and yet there's only a couple people, one guiding the horse herd, and just a couple others to make sure they're not veering off, yet all the horses are going in the same direction. And this is what I started looking at with the Turks and Mongols and how they utilize that on the battlefield. But while I was doing all these studies, I started running across games that these people played. So I thought during this topic, that's what I would look at. I'm going to start with something that's a little more familiar with, and is the medieval tournament in Europe and the misconceptions that we get on historical inaccuracies, as I'll call them here. And this all comes from Hollywood, and if you're familiar with these places called Medieval Times, I lived in Dallas and there was a Medieval Times there. I've also traveled in Europe and they have similar things there. They're quite entertaining and they're fun to go to. I recommend it, but it's definitely very misleading as to what it actually really was. The origins of the tournament are basically in the medieval period around the time of Charlemagne, about the 9th, 10th century, and become very popular in the 11th and 12th century, but they are not the individual sport that you see on movies and everything with two knights running at each other with a line in between and trying to knock each other with a horse. If any of you seen Game of Thrones in the early seasons, they actually expounded on that. The objective of the tournament was never to kill your opponent. It was to try to capture them. But the way they did this is they run in large groups. Sometimes tournaments, when they were announced, may only have 30 to 100 riders. Sometimes, if they could, in large areas, would have several hundred riders or knights out there, or militae is the Latin term. And they would run in small groups. And if they could, they would identify the wealthiest person on the other side, and those small groups would try to capture that knight. And in return, they would ransom the knight and his horse. The horse at times could be more valuable than the knight. And if that knight couldn't, he might be able to ransom himself, but if his family couldn't afford to ransom the horse, he lost the horse. And in a sense, he lost his prestige as a knight. And the other great thing about the tournament is it was practicing for war, or what we call the French term melee, or mock battles. And although they're mock battles, they're still quite brutal. The weapons are blunted, the lances were blunted, the swords, the maces may not have spikes on them, but it was still used to beat the, excuse my language, the crap out of each other. And to give you a good example, William Marshall, considered the greatest knight of his time. They all had to wait for him to take his helmet off. He was at the smithy, and they actually had to cut it off because he was bashed in so much. He was actually awarded the greatest prize there. One of the problems with the melee or the tournament is it became quite a spectator sport. They would always try to make the tournaments close to villages or any place where they could get food, water, supplies, lots of smithies there, or smiths there who could work on the armor. And at times, these people would start cheering on the knights. And then the knights, in turn, would get angry and actually start attacking the peasants. So this is when the church gets involved. And you start hearing about Pax Dei, the peace of God, or Pax Triaga, the truce of God. The whole idea was to limit what these knights could fight and who they can fight. For example, you can't fight on Tuesday or on Lent. You can't fight on Sundays, any religious holiday. And at the same time, the Pax Triaga was who you could fight. You can't go beat up on monasteries. You can't go beat up on peasants. It was supposed to be the nobility upon the nobility. However, with the failure of Pax Dei and Triaga Dei, this at times made the church rethink this and start saying, hey, instead of letting these medieval knights beat up on each other, let's send them over to the Middle East. That's a very simplistic, but it is a very small contributing factor to the Crusades. Anyways, one other thing about the medieval tournament is it was very brutal, and at times it did cause death. So in the Middle East, when the Crusaders had taken the Levant, they did participate in tournaments, but not to a great extent. Another problem with that is if a group of knights left a region, the marauding Bedouins and the marauding Turks would actually raid through their territory. So while it was in the Middle East, it just wasn't as fun as it was in the Europe. The next equestrian sport I want to look at is called buzkashi, or kukburi, and it literally translates to goat pulling, or in Mongolia they just call it goat rodeo. And it is under different terms. Afghanistan, buzkashi is the most common term. In Kazakhstan, kokpar, and northwest China, just east of the Altai Mountain, it's Gyeonggan, and basically it's an entertaining way of the old raiding that the steppe tribes would used to do, or at least that's the way anthropologist Whitney Azoid likes to describe it in his book. He's the only person that's actually sat down and written about the buzkashi sport. The hardest thing that I found is trying to take it from a historical background and looking to see how far back it went. That was really difficult. Azoid, of course, being an anthropologist, really looks at the cultural meaning of buzkashi, and if you're interested in that, his book is pretty good. Sometimes it can be really dry with his anthropological theory approach. Anyways, in goat pulling, you can see here the riders, they're actually picking up a goat, and they actually pick up a ground. I'll show you in the next slide, and I'll show you what the objective of the sport. The goat was decapitated, the hooves were cut off so that we didn't have any sharp objects on them, and I go to the next screen. See here, I'm going to go forward. You'll see they're picking the goat up off the ground, and then your objective was to take it to a different area. And there's two ways the sport is broken into areas here. One is the more civilized way, or the more modern way, is the goat is dropped on the ground here. The riders surround the area. Today, it's a little more civilized, so it's two different teams. They ride into the area. One of the riders tries to grab the goat, and then they ride around the flag, and one team will drop it off here, or the other team there. While you have the goat, this is where the fun begins. Everybody else has any rule to take that goat away from you. That means they can hit you, horse can plow you over, and you're to stay on the horse while you're doing this. In the earlier periods, it's talked about how people got whipped when they were trying to do that. Horses were trained to bite, and horses for these games were actually trained specifically for these games. And that's why you see the terms, Chapandas, he's an export buzkashi rider. He may not ride his own personal horse, but he's hired by a horse breeder to use his horse, and actually the horse has more frame than some of these riders do in the areas. Down at the bottom, you'll see the term here, tubat. Can you pronounce that for me? It's Persian I'm not as good at. What? Tudarai. It's basically Persian for getting out of the crowd. And this is the early versions of buzkashi. Basically, there is no team. It's every rider for themselves. And this could be a small group of 20, and it could be a group of several hundred. And basically, it's a free-for-all. Usually the bravest person rides in first, and everybody is surrounding it. He grabs the goat, and he has to fight his way out of the crowd. And you can see right here the free-for-all trying to get out. And it's the rider who can get out with the goat in a secure, or I wouldn't say secure area, but basically away from the crowd, which can lead to greater disputes because then what's considered free and away from the crowd. And so this is just as brutal as the medieval tournament. So, and in Afghanistan, it's actually today considered the national sport. It is also very, very popular up in Kazakhstan, and as well as Xinjiang, just north of there in the Altai Mountains. The Uyghur people will play it to there. And that is where, at least in my research, Altai Mountains here is where the sport comes from. I couldn't find anything that specifically acknowledges that, but doing my research, it seems to come from there and then spreads westward during the Turkish and Mongol invasions coming down into Central Asia. The other activity sometimes wouldn't be considered a sport, yet it definitely was, and that's the royal hunt. You can find a nice book by historian Thomas Olson, who actually wrote several hundred pages on the royal hunt through time, all the way through the Eurasian continent. The hunt starts all the way back at the time of Alexander the Great, the pharaohs of Egypt, the Achaemenid Persians, and even in China under the first emperor, Shi Huangdi. And all animals were hunted, but the prized animal was the cat, the boar, but the northern steppes was the bear. And the reason for this is it would fight back. And to give an example of this is Richard the Lionheart during the Third Crusade. His horse was injured while he was fighting the boar, and they actually had to go in and rescue him because they thought he was going to get mauled by the boar. Nonetheless, you can see all the nice reliefs. They started out using chariots because at the time of the early horse period, they didn't ride the horses. They used the horses to pull the chariots. And then as time goes along, here's in the Achaemenid Persian fighting the cat. In China, Persia, Anatolia, the hunt was conducted in two areas. One could be the open field, and another area could be in the wildlife parks that they create. Kublai Khan in China was very famous for creating a park. In the Sultanate of Delhi, they also created parks, would invite dignitaries. It was a way to show off your military force, to show off your prestige. And it was also a great time to knock off some of your opponents or assassination. Take them out on a hunt. They mysteriously get killed by a wild cat. Somehow you got unhorsed. So it's actually not only beneficial to eliminating that, it was also beneficial for gathering food. The steppe nomad tribes, the Mongols and the Turks, would actually use this as a way of training for the military and gathering food supplies. They would actually take their horses and their riders, and it would go for kilometers around and slowly sweep and create a big circle, then enclose the circle. The Mongols were so strict in this that if a rabbit escaped between two riders, those two riders were executed. And that's how they were really, really strict on that. They used it for military training. Now, what's interesting is if you read through some of the sources on the Mongol Nurj, which is their term for the hunt, Atta Malik Shivani and Rashid al-Din Tabib, they actually go into great detail of what this was. When you read through the military history of the Mongols, they talk about the Nurj was great for the battlefield. And yes, that was true, but it was actually used on a greater extent of deploying the armies coming from like Mongolia into the Central and Southwest Asia state areas of like Khwarezmia, Khorasan, or modern day Afghanistan, Iraq, Turkmenistan. And it was on a much bigger scale. And this is here Kublai Khan in his park in China. You can see Kublai has gotten quite hefty, and there was a lot of complaints on that. And it actually got to the point where Marco Polo claims that it used elephants to transport him. Over here, you can see this is a Chinese depiction of the hunt here, rider going in, shooting the deer. And the next slide here is in the 18th century during the Qing dynasty. The Qing, for those of you who are aware, are actually Manchus coming out of the area of Manchuria. Here's a perfect example of the troops here that they use. These guys here are making a circle. Here are the animals in here. And what they would do with the steppe nomads is after they circled the animals, one of the, for example, in the Mongols, the Khan would go in and actually kill the first animal. He always got the first choice. After that, then it was a free-for-all for those who want to go in and brave fighting some of the wild cats or the boars or the bears. And then after that, after the killing, before all the animals were killed, elders would come in and stop the killing. This is where the Mongols and the Turks were really good at understanding about the ecology of the area and not wiping out all the animals. They would actually conduct a hunt in one area and then let a few animals escape. Then they would move to a great distance and do another hunt in that area, knowing that they can't wipe out the population in that, the animal population. There are a couple other games, what we call, some people call civilized, and that would be Jarid. This is a Turkish game. It's still played in Turkey today. You can go on YouTube and watch it, as well as Buzkashi. And the whole idea, it's two teams, and one rider will ride up with a blunted javelin and throw it at the other team and trying to hit the rider, not the horse. It is very, very bad to hit the horse. And I have read about one guy, he was disqualified for hitting a horse. And if you ever watch this, it's actually really difficult to hit the rider and not hit the horse. Anyways, the other team, once one team threw it, the other rider would ride up and throw the javelin. And what you get back and forth there is the enticing the other team to bring one of his riders up. Then when he's fleeing, the rest of the people to pursue and try to nab him and hit him. Another game that was extremely popular, especially in the regions of Persia and the Arab world, is polo. And it's played in the hippodromes right outside of the city, or in Arabic, Maidan or Maidan. And this was used to really train the riders and working with the horse and on a team. As Professor Mirda Kia pointed out to me a while back, even in the Persian areas, even women played the game, and during the Ottoman period were able to defeat the men. This was all about horsemanship and controlling the horse, and it was extremely popular. Now, I haven't read anything about women playing in the Arab regions on there, but the Persians treated women a little bit different than the Arabs did. Horse archery is still a sport played today. There are two guys north of here at Big Fork and one in Columbia Falls. They actually practice horse archery, and they're the ones who I started talking to as well, and getting information about how groups of horses and riders works with shooting their arrows. They go to Hungary. It's the national sport there of horse archery, and they actually run the horse down the path and they start shooting. And then as they shoot sideways, as well as shooting backwards, or the Parthian shot, as the Romans called it, and that term actually stuck all the way through the Crusader period and to today. In Japan, it's still quite popular. Reaching back for the samurai periods, where they do the horse archery, although it's much more subdued than it is in Hungary. And you do see it here in the United States and Canada, but it's not as popular as it is over there. Anyways, I wrote a little thing here, and I'm not going to read it all, but basically what I was looking at here when it came to the games and the significance is there were two terms that I was looking at. One was synchrony, and the other was synchronization. I grew up around horses, and I was always taught to be in synchrony with the horse, one with the rider, and not being like you see in the movies where these people are bouncing on the horse. They're horrible riders. There are games played here in Montana, and as well as anywhere out west here, called omoxis, and it's a Blackfoot term meaning horse games. And you watch those riders, they're taught to ride bareback first and to stay on the horse and control the horse, sometimes using their knees or even voice commands or using the reins. The other term that I was really looking at was called synchronization, and that is the idea of taking a look at wildlife or wildlife in the biology area, look at flocks of birds, how they fly. They can change directions and yet not knock each other out of the sky. They can also, horses and cattle and camels, they can actually be at a run and not jostle each other. And so that's where I took it from there, and that's how the Mongols and the Turks were able to do it, is these riders who were able to let their horses run at their opponent without having to sit there and steer and then still fire their bows and be accurate. And with that, I'll go ahead and close, and I guess we'll leave it open for any questions.
Thank you, Chris. The next session starts at 2:30, so we have a few minutes for a few questions. Please, there are two actually microphones, one there and one there. Please go to the microphone and bring up your question if you have one. And we're going to be the group members, panel members, we're going to respond to it, answer it.
I have a question. but do I need to go up to the?
Please do, yeah.
Yeah. I don't know any of your names except for Carson, but in the red shirt?
Yes.
With the jungle being closed or having shut down in the last few years, how do you think that's going to influence what you were saying about the UK needing to take in or getting more people going through the tunnel?
About the border security. If I figure with thank you, with the UK leaving the EU, now that people, if they do remove their border agents and refugees know that they will have an easier time getting into the border, I think that the border camp could actually reemerge and re-expand to let people get in. Because really it was destroyed partly through an agreement with the British government and the French government to prevent people from jumping in because refugees were dying, trying to smuggle themselves into trucks, going through the tunnel, such that there was one who climbed into like a truck full of water and drowned in it, and they didn't discover him until he got into the UK. So I think if they know that they'll have an easier time getting across the channel, that they will retry to go through the tunnel.
Garrett, I got a question for you. So with the emergence of the second sect of the Taliban taking power in Pakistan, in your research, did you come across how India feels about this? With a radical group that doesn't necessarily get along with them having access to nuclear weapons?
Yeah, I didn't focus on that a lot with the Taliban, the Tehrik-i Taliban, Pakistani Taliban, but anytime that you have Pakistan getting any sort of nuclear capability or really any sort of notoriety or anything, India is not going to be too pleased. And through that, you actually you can expand on there to look at relations into the wider area, because I believe it's Saudi Arabia that has repeatedly said that they would get a nuke from Pakistan if Iran had one. And then you're talking just keeping expanding on that. So sorry if that wasn't a real answer to your question, but.
Another thing you've got to remember, though, is that even though Pakistan does have democratic institutions, it's fundamentally a military dictatorship that gets a huge amount of weapons and material support from the United States in order to maintain a presence within the government and also affect the military's control over the nuclear weapons. So even though there is like a real concern that there are radical groups getting access through democratic institutions to nuclear technology, we've got to understand what like the real structure of the Pakistani state is, and that is a military dictatorship. And they're not going to allow a group in the Taliban or a radical group to actually exercise authority over nuclear technology, because then the state itself would be invaded and they'd institute a regime change, from what I've known, what I've seen. So just touch it.
I got a question for the gentleman that was describing the use of knights and horses and.
Chris, I think
who
that's
was
you.
that?
Yeah.
Something occurred to me. I used to play chess, but I haven't played it for a long time. Is that how the game chess came up? You know, like the knight, and the difference between knight, the value, and the horse was very, very different. And you made a great point at pointing that out. But I was thinking, I wonder if that's where the game of chess evolved.
It's been a while since I've read on the game of chess. It actually starts in the Mediterranean area. And one of the biggest complaints in the Crusades, for example, is at the Siege of Acre in 1192, 1191, 1192, in that area, is when the knights were coming on crusade to Europe, that during the slow periods, their biggest complaint was they're playing chess with the Arabs or the Turks. And so in the whole Mediterranean area, they knew about chess before the knightly class came about. And I can't remember the origin. I think it's more Middle Eastern and even Persian area where you see chess. Oh yeah, it does. But then of course, you know, everything is coming over from, we're a European descendant, so it's changed to the meet the European stuff. But yeah, you'll see games and Frederick II in Sicily playing chess, and actually show Arabs playing against Europeans on chess there. And it was very popular with it. Yeah. To a
It's-
degree, yeah.
This is an interesting question in the sense that chess and backgammon has a kind of back and forth type of story. Chess was invented in India, and as a mystery, it was sent to Sassanid court that they promised them a gigantic prize if they find out how it's played. So this is like 5th century, 6th century, end of 5th century, beginning of 5th century, when Khosrow was the king of Sassanid in Setisfun, the capital of Sassanid. And Buzurgmehr was the prime minister at that time. And it was a genius who ran the court, and he found out how they play it. And they sent back backgammon, and the Indians asked if we won't be able to find how this, what the price you're expecting for. So they said that, oh, okay, well, if you give us 1 grain per square onward, like multiple the grain number by itself, like 2 times 2, 4, 4 times 4, 16. And people thought that, wow, it's going to be few grains. But if you see like 8 times 8, 64, if you go to the 64th square, there are tons of grains actually we are talking about. So that is, it's a story to it that goes back and forth between chess, that they win something for it, and then backgammon, that they win something for it, like grain in return. That is like 5th century, end of 5th century, 6th century, between Indian court and the Sassanid court. Oh, thanks. Any other questions? Well, we had wonderful presentation. It's very nice of you to stay this long. And I congratulate every single presenter here for their time and their extra exceptional presentation they had. The next session, it starts at 2:30 on refugees. So please check there are copies of the schedule here. Please help yourself with a copy, and have a wonderful time at the conference. Thanks again for coming. Thanks.